everybody, Shwazy here, and in today's video, I'm going to be giving you my 2-year update of the 2020 Dodge Challenger Hellcat Widebody. Okay, so as I said, we're going to be giving you my 2-year update of owning this vehicle since I picked it up in October of 2020. Now, I have made a video about all of the things I love and hate about this particular vehicle. I'm going to link it up on the screen right now and down in the description below so you guys can check out that video. But in today's video, we're going to be talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Dodge Challenger. And then I'm going to finish off with the Q&A section because I posed a question to you guys last week asking you what you want to know about this vehicle, and there are some interesting questions that I'll be addressing later on in the video. So without further ado, let's get started and talk about all of the good of the Dodge Challenger Hellcat Widebody. Okay, now in no particular order, the first good or the first thing that I really love after 2 years has to do with the sound. And I'm not just talking the exhaust, I'm talking the Hellcat engine as well with that supercharger whine, but the exhaust is like one of the most intoxicating. Now, let me show you what that sounds like right now. Yeah, I'm sure you're agreeing with me there. Now, keep in mind, this particular vehicle does have the Dynamax race bullets instead of the mufflers over here underneath the passenger compartment. So it does sound a little bit different than your stock Hellcat. But even if you have a stock Hellcat, they sound amazing. I mean, out of the big 3 muscle cars, I would say this is probably one of the best sounding, aside from maybe the Shelby GT350 with that flat plane crank. But really good engine sound and really good exhaust. And now for the next thing that's good about this vehicle, and it really depends on your perspective, but this thing gets a lot of attention, and that has to do with the looks. I mean, this thing looks really menacing. I mean, it looks like it's going to eat you when it's just standing still, and especially with this dual snorkel setup and that big front splitter, I mean, this thing looks aggressive. And so depending on whether you like that or not, you're gonna get a lot of attention in this vehicle because it just looks so menacing. And especially so at car shows. You can take this and park it next to like a Lamborghini, and I'm not gonna lie, but this thing will get almost as much, if not just as much attention as the Lambo. Now, I will say that has died down just a little bit over the last 2 years, but when I first picked this vehicle up 2 years ago, I probably got stopped like 5 or 6 times in the first week I owned it from people just asking me everything about this vehicle. Maybe that had to do with the temporary tags, but people were just really in love with this vehicle, and I think it has to do with the color and the shape and the wide body and the sound. It's kind of the whole experience. I think the reason attention has gone down over the last 2 years is just because the market is saturated with Dodge Challengers and Chargers and Hellcat engines. They've just been making them for like 7 years at this point, so there's a lot of them out there. But 2 years ago, this thing was the king of the car show, and even today, it's still a very popular and attention-grabbing vehicle. Now, for the next feature, we're going to talk about the tech. And keep in mind, mine's a pretty basic, simple version. And even mine has some really cool amenities like heated, ventilated seats, heated steering wheel. You've got all of the Bluetooth, Sirius XM, and just really nice technology that you wouldn't necessarily expect out of kind of a bare bones muscle car. Really nice, luxurious technology that I didn't even have in my Mercedes back from 2013. So that's got to be the next thing I've really enjoyed about the Hellcat. And of course, for the next good about this Hellcat is, of course, the engine. I mean, that goes without saying, and the power and just the crazy value that you get for a vehicle under $100,000 to have 717 horsepower. It's really just insane. And with that, I will say the other thing that I've noticed over 2 years is when you drive this vehicle, you just feel like a badass. I mean, there's not really any other way to describe it. If you've ever driven one of these vehicles, you'll probably be able to relate, but there's really just kind of a different otherworldly experience when you're driving one of these that just makes you feel awesome. I mean, you just feel like you can conquer the world because you have limitless horsepower under the hood, regardless of whether you could put that power down to the ground, but you do feel that just behind the steering wheel. It just feels really, really exhilarating. And that's got to be probably the biggest takeaway from the 2 years of ownership is this thing just feels cool to drive. Okay, now that we've talked about the good, let's roast this vehicle and talk about the bad. Well, the first thing, which is something I've mentioned in dozens of different videos is the fact that, you know, you really can't put all of that power to the ground. I mean, this is a 305 millimeter wide tire, and I was going about 40 miles an hour yesterday from 0 to 40, and I still didn't have any traction. I mean, this thing loses traction at 60 miles per hour. And take a look at these tires. They're really not in bad shape. They have about 6,500 miles on them. So relatively new tires, but I will say even at the 1,000 mile mark, they still couldn't put the power to the ground. Now, these are the stock Pirelli P0 tires, and of course I could upgrade and get better tires on this vehicle, but from the factory this thing should hook up a little bit better. Whatever they need to do, they need to ensure that the tires are consistent with the power of this vehicle, and unfortunately they're not, because I don't think there's really any other tire outside of a drag radial that will put this power to the ground. Now, every time I bring this up in a video, people will always roast me and say I just can't drive this vehicle and it takes a real man to drive a Hellcat. You know what? I'm gonna call total stinking BS on that, because probably 99% of the people that drive this vehicle will not be able to know how to put that power to the ground. I'll be the first one to admit it. I don't know how to put the power to the ground on this vehicle. No matter how much I try, I still can't get my pedal to the floor ratio down correctly to be able to gain traction. And I guarantee you, the majority, 95% of you out there won't be able to do the same. The lucky 5% of you that have experience driving these types of cars, maybe on a track, maybe previous racing experience, then you could probably put this power down. But for the majority of us, we're just gonna be spinning all day. That's just the truth. Now, the next thing I've noticed is, you know, back when I had a Scat Pack, I felt like at every car show I went to, or every time somebody saw the vehicle, they would always ask, is that a Hellcat? Is that a Hellcat? That was kind of the constant thing in the back of my mind is, you know, I don't have a Hellcat. Well, you may be surprised, but now that I actually have a Hellcat, people still come up to me and say, is that the Red Eye? Is that the Demon? So no matter which level you get, unless I guess you get the Demon, you're always going to be asked the question of whether it's the higher trim level or the more powerful version of the car that you have. So I thought as soon as I got the Hellcat, that was kind of the top of the top. Well, that's a big fat no, because people will still come up to you at car shows and compare it to a more powerful version. So if that's the reason you're getting one of these vehicles, well, you might be unpleasantly surprised. The next thing that hasn't been so great about the Challenger is its proportions. I mean, as you can tell here, this thing is extremely large. It is larger probably than any other coupe on the market aside from something out of the 70s. And because of that, even though I've owned the Challenger platform for probably about 4.5 years, I still don't really understand the proportions of it. I mean, I still park at curbs from like 5 feet away because I don't know where the front end of this vehicle is and I don't want to scrape the splitter. And with that, the door is absolutely massive. I mean, this thing is the size, like I mentioned before, of a football field. And when you're parking in tight spots, it's extremely hard to get in and out of the vehicle. And unfortunately, my garage is somewhat tight. And so every time I park this car, I have to reach my hand around the door so I make sure I don't ding it when I'm getting in and out. So just something to consider. If you are in a tighter city or a smaller home, you may not want to get a Challenger because it's the size of a yacht. Now, the next thing I've noticed, and along the lines of not being able to put the power to the ground, is the fact that a lot of people want to race you. And unfortunately, a lot of people may win. This thing is not the quickest, like I said, 0 to 60. And so if you can't put that power to the ground, if it's, you know, maybe slightly cooler, you may lose a race to maybe like a Subaru WRX or a Golf R or, you know, a lot of those Audi all-wheel drive vehicles. I mean, this is not the quickest 0 to 60. And so I tend not to compete in any stoplight races because I know I'm going to lose. Now, quarter mile and top speed, that's a different story. That's what these vehicles really shine. But in all honesty, when you're talking about just day-to-day driving and trying to, you know, win off the stoplight, you're probably not going to do that in this thing. The other thing that's not so great about the Challenger is the build quality. And I don't think that's to anybody's real surprise, but it's just not fantastic for a vehicle that's almost $80,000. I talked about this in the hate video, but you already have kind of peeling paint over here. And then there's times when it's a little bit cooler and I'm pulling into like a driveway or a curb or somewhere, and I can hear kind of a creak coming in from the windshield, and it's the same sound I would hear from my Scat Pack. So I know it's kind of the Challenger platform in general and not just a particular vehicle because I've noticed it on 2 cars. Just things like that where the build quality could be a little bit better, especially when you're paying a price range like this. I think that has to do with the fact that this platform is just almost 20 years old. I mean, this is built from the times when Dodge was merged with Daimler and Mercedes, and so they're using pretty old technology, and I think it's in need of an update. Unfortunately, we won't be able to see a Hellcat engine in the updated platform because, well, it looks like Dodge and FCA are going into electric. Okay, we've talked about the good, we've talked about the bad, now let's talk about the ugly. And well, you may be able to guess, but the ugly really has to do with the cost. I'm gonna first start off with the cost of acquiring a new or used one today, which is absolutely insane. I mean, I just did a quick search in my local classifieds and I found that a lot of them were going over 70, 80, 90, some over $100,000 for used Hellcats in a world where maybe 2 years ago they were going for $45, $50, maybe $55,000. I mean, the market right now for any car in general, but especially one of these, is truly insane. And so I don't know if I would recommend anybody pay those types of prices unless you can get a really good deal somehow. Maybe you're acquainted with somebody who's selling one, but otherwise these things are extremely expensive to acquire here in October of 2022. I mean, if prices were the way they are today back 2 years ago in October of 2020 when I picked this vehicle up, well, this vehicle would not be on the channel because I would not be purchasing it. The second part of the ugly is, well, the gas mileage, which can be expected, but let me show you what I've averaged over, well, the last 2 years of ownership. So pulling it up on the screen right now, you can see I have averaged 16.9 mpg, which is honestly on the better end because I recently took it on a little bit of a longer trip on the highway, and so that improved the mpg, but I've probably averaged somewhere around 15.5, maybe even as low as 15 mpg driving it in the city. And so with gas prices for at least 91 octane, which this supercharged engine requires, you're looking at a pretty penny every time you refill this car. And even though a lot of people say, well, if you're buying a Hellcat, you're not worried about gas prices, unless you're like a billionaire, you're still probably gonna consider that because it's still gonna cost you money. Just because you have money doesn't mean you're stupid with it and you're gonna purposefully burn it just because you can. You're likely gonna try to save money as much as somebody who maybe doesn't have as much. And so MPG and gas prices do impact how often you're gonna drive the vehicle. And so that's something that's a little bit ugly about this vehicle, even though considering 717 horsepower and almost 17 mpg really isn't that bad. But in the grand scheme of things, it is not great mpg. Okay, now the last part of the ugly of the Dodge Challenger Hellcat really has to do with insurance. Now, I'm not going to name the particular numbers of what I'm paying for my insurance because insurance premiums are a very, very particular number based on your situation. Where are you located? Where do you live? How do you drive the car? Where do you park the vehicle? How many miles do you drive it? How many vehicles you have? I mean, all of these things come into consideration when pricing the premium for your vehicle. And so I don't think me giving you a number is really gonna help you in any way because that's very particular to my situation. What I will tell you is how much the insurance went up from when I had the Scat Pack. For those of you that don't know, I had a 2017 Dodge Challenger 392 Hemi Scat Pack shaker, and I upgraded to this thing. And from what I remember when I made this video a few years ago, my insurance premium went up about 25 to 30% from what it was when I had the Scat Pack. Now, just for kicks and giggles, the other day I quoted a Dodge Challenger Scat Pack on my insurance policy to see what's the difference between a Scat Pack V8 and a supercharged V8 like the Hellcat. Well, it was actually pretty interesting because what I found out is without having a VIN number, obviously these are estimates, my premium would be approximately 40% lower in today's dollars if I had a Scat Pack over a Hellcat. That's a pretty big difference, and I think that difference has increased from when I upgraded 2 years ago because I think thefts for these cars have increased, inflation obviously, and just the price for these vehicles and how expensive they are to replace. I think all of those things factored into the increase in my premium and the larger difference between the Scat Pack and the Hellcat. But I think a lot of people forget about the difference in insurance when they're considering upgrading a vehicle, so just keep that in mind. You may be looking to pay a pretty hefty premium when you upgrade from a Scat Pack to a Hellcat. Okay, so that finishes off the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Dodge Challenger Hellcat Widebody. Now let's jump into the Q&A section because you guys have a lot of good questions. Okay, I'm gonna start off with Instagram, and the first question that I received, and I apologize if I mispronounce your handle or your name, but it's from Das_Shank. He said, is the Hellcat good for really long road trips? And that is a really good question, but there's kind of two parts to it. One, in terms of comfort and ride quality, yes, it's great for road trips. Lots of space, even for a passenger to stretch out, even potentially lay the seat back and fall asleep. Not that much room for rear passengers, but if it's just two people, yeah, it's great. Where it's bad is fuel economy. Now, on the highway, you might be able to get close to 20 mpg, but those numbers are like the city range for a typical crossover. So it's not horrible on highway driving, but you may be stopping to fill up a little bit, and you got to fill up with 91 octane like I mentioned earlier. So yes, it's great from a comfort standpoint, no from a cost standpoint. Now, Fabs41 asked me, gas economy for sure though. So as you guys could see, I get about 17 mpg, but when I drive mostly in the city, it's closer to 15. Next question from Hugh.tk_, the difference between buying your first Mopar and now. Not a huge difference. I mean, the first one I purchased used, and it was kind of a different experience than me buying this one new and driving it home about 500 miles. But overall, they've been kind of similar in terms of reliability, and I can't say I've noticed a big difference between the buying experience between the two. In terms of the channel, it was a lot smaller when I purchased my first Mopar than it is now, and obviously the Challenger really helped grow this channel to the next level. So I am hugely appreciative of the gray Scat Pack that I used to have, but I know that the Hellcat has also helped grow the channel in a lot of different ways. Now, Code Beebs asked me, what's it like to own a top-tier muscle car? Well, in all honesty, it's not a huge difference from me owning a Scat Pack. You would think there would be a much larger difference between the two, but like I said, in day-to-day driving, you really don't feel it. And I don't go into any drag strips or anything like that just because there's not really any around me. The closest one is an 1/8 mile track because the 1/4 mile track shut down a few years ago. And so I don't really notice a big difference, except for this thing does get more attention, I would say, than the Scat Pack did. I think the little emblem on the side of the car, the dual snorkel, the purple color, I think people notice this a lot more. Even though the Scat Pack did get a lot of attention, I immediately noticed more attention to this vehicle when I picked it up. And I think even to this day, people are still stunned. And that may also have to do with the fact that it is a wide body Challenger. Savini79 asked, how many pink slips have you won? I haven't won any pink slips. I haven't done any races. You know, this vehicle has been pretty babied for a Hellcat. Great question from Boston Jonathans asking, after owning a Mercedes-Benz C-Series and Dodge, you rather have a muscle car or prefer a German sports car? Really good question. High level, I like the variety. I enjoyed very much having a luxury sports sedan that was pretty nimble and maneuverable, not super quick, but quick enough. And at the same time, I've really loved having that American muscle car, that culture, that Mopar community has been really nice. And so, you know, it would be nice to have a little bit of both. I'll be honest, I've kind of missed a little bit of that luxury from the German side. Recently, I reviewed a BMW i4, which I had for a week. And, you know, the nice touches inside the vehicle, that kind of German build quality, I do miss that. Now, what's funny is, this is kind of a German car in a way. I mean, like I said earlier, this was built around the same time that Daimler and Mercedes owned Chrysler. And so a lot of the components here actually do remind me of older Mercedes products. And so it's kind of funny. I went from owning a true German sports sedan to a quasi-German sports car. I think it just depends on what mood you're in and what point in life you're in. Because for me, I really wanted this big, brawny muscle car, and I got it. At the same time, I can totally see the appeal of a more nimble and quicker, potentially, sports sedan from the Germans. For me, I just like driving different things every few years, and that's what I find fun. But in terms of displacement, there's really nothing that can beat the American muscle cars. Okay, now let's jump to the YouTube questions, and first came from T-Bone03. And he asked, time flies when you're doing 130 miles per hour all the time. Can't wait. So not even a question, but just an exciting statement. Thank you, T-Bone. The next question is from longtime subscriber Todd Watkins. He asks, how much longer is your lease and do you plan on keeping it? Great question. For those of you that don't know, I am leasing this Hellcat. I made a video series all about how I did that and how I purchased this vehicle, so you guys can go check that out from about a year and a half ago. I have, I believe, a year left on the lease. I believe it was a 3-year lease, 36,000 miles. As of today, I am at, I want to say 6,600 miles. So I've got about 30,000 miles I can run in a year. But in all seriousness, I do not have any plans to give this vehicle back to the dealer. And that really has to do with the fact that I'd be kind of leaving money on the table. I mean, the residual value of my car at the end of its lease is likely going to be lower than the true market value of this vehicle, at least based on today's prices, as I was telling you earlier. So if I do choose to give this vehicle up in a year from now, I'm likely going to sell it privately or sell it to some other dealership rather than just handing the keys back to the dealership that I purchased it from, because, well, that's just kind of losing money. Now, my other options, either to sell it, like I said, to somebody else privately or to a dealership, or to buy it out. And, you know, a lot of things can change. It really depends on where the economy is going to be a year from now, what new vehicles are out, what regulations are out. But currently, I'm leaning towards heavily keeping this vehicle for the near term, maybe even the long term. I do not have plans to sell this vehicle in a year. I might end up making a full video on this next year when it comes closer to the lease ending, but I'm probably just going to go and finance this vehicle because of 2 reasons. One is the fact that the prices for these vehicles are insane. And so if I sell this vehicle and maybe end up regretting it and wanting to buy it back again, I'm likely not going to be able to afford it because prices for these cars are just out of this world. The second reason, which wasn't really a factor 2 years ago, is the fact that this engine, the Hellcat, is a dying breed. I mean, Dodge has already said they're axing it as of 2023. They're already introducing electric vehicles. And so I am probably never again in my lifetime going to be able to own a 717 horsepower supercharged Hemi engine. And just for that fact alone, I'm going to try to hold on to this car as long as possible. And hopefully my itch for some other vehicle doesn't take over and force me to sell it. Now, Oscar LeBron asked, are you able to do a size tire recommendation from a Scat Pack perspective, narrow body and wide body? You know, my recommendation may be a little bit off because my Scat Pack actually had wider tires than this wide body Hellcat. I had 315 millimeter wide tires in the back, which wasn't recommended, but I had no issues with it in the year and a half or 2 years that I owned it. The Hellcat right now has 305s, and all I'm gonna say is no matter how much tire you have back there, it's really not enough. I mean, the 315s on my Scat Pack, I would still lose traction if I was really hammering it down. On this thing, I always lose traction. If I ever push the gas pedal down more than halfway, I'm losing traction. On the Scat Pack, it was a little bit more manageable. Only really from a dead stop would I lose traction if I just hammered it down to the ground. But in either case, it just wasn't enough tire. My one recommendation is, I'm not sure if they still do 245 wide tires on the narrow body and the Scat Pack. You got to go for at least 275 wide tires. And then if you get the wide body, I think the 305s are likely going to be just right for a vehicle with that much horsepower. I've never driven the wide body Scat Pack, so I can't say for sure, but I think 305s are an appropriate amount of width for a 485 horsepower vehicle. LX Quid said, can't wait to get one. Good luck, my friend. Hopefully you get one for a good deal. Chris Dela Cruz said, what were your maintenance costs? Great question. My maintenance costs were pretty much identical to my Scat Pack. So I have gone in once a year to do just the routine oil change, tire rotation, filters, etc. And I purchased a 3-year service plan with my local dealership. And I believe the service plan included 3 routine oil changes, an air filter, and tire rotations. And for those 3 services, I paid in advance $183. So when you divide it over 3 services, it's like $60 a service. So pretty cheap maintenance costs. And I purchased that same maintenance plan when I had my Scat Pack, and it was pretty much the same price. From what I've been told, the SRT products, regardless of whether it's the 6.4 or the 6.2 engine, it's going to be the same service plan, and so it's going to be essentially the same cost. I think each dealership might do it a little bit differently, but overall, it's been really cheap maintenance compared to the $400 or $500, maybe even $600 that I would drop down on my Mercedes-Benz service when I would do it once a year or every 10,000 miles. But that's been the only repairs and maintenance costs that I've had to pay for. I haven't changed the brakes or the tires yet, although it's probably time that I should upgrade the rear tires. Now, the next question is from Desmond Brooks asking, any rough issue repairs? The answer is no. As I just mentioned earlier, I haven't had any other repairs or anything like that. If you guys do recall, when I first picked this vehicle up, I did have a weird sound coming from my seatbelt. I took that to the dealership. They addressed it, fixed it, no problems. Haven't had any issues since then. And then I sometimes hear a squeak from underneath the driver's seat. I think that has to do with the railing, but it's not super noticeable and I haven't really been able to replicate it, but that's not something I've gone to the dealership to fix. Aside from that, the only times I've gone to the dealership is for oil changes. Mr. 300C, how you doing, my man? He asks, can you come pick me up? Haha. Yes, we definitely have to do a ride along. He has got a Hemi V8 300C, and if you guys don't know his channel, make sure you check it out because he's got some really cool content on that. So yes, Mr. 300C, we got to do some sort of collaboration. And the last question is from Brian O'Shea, and hopefully I pronounced your last name correctly. Thank you for always watching the videos. He asks, do you miss the Hemi shaker at all? And you know, I'm going to finish that off as my last answer because that is a loaded question. I do miss the shaker. Now, it's really more of an emotional attachment that I had to that vehicle than like a logical one. Because rationally speaking, this vehicle I know is better than my Scat Pack. Horsepower, overall engineering, interior quality. I mean, there's a lot of things that are better on this vehicle than the Scat Pack. But for some reason, I still do think about that car occasionally. And I can't say I think about other vehicles I've owned as often as I think about that Scat Pack. Maybe it had to do with the shaker hood, the fact that it looked more like a true retro muscle car than the wide-body Hellcat I have. It was my first muscle car, and so I think that's why I miss it. But if I had the option to go back in time and make that decision over again, I don't think I would change my mind. I mean, the fact that I got this vehicle for a great deal, which I've made videos on in the past, and the fact that this thing is the top-tier muscle car, you know, you really can't pass that up, even though that vehicle was extraordinary. And it kind of comes back to the topic that I've made in other videos where if you really don't have that much money to swing to get a Hellcat, you are not going to regret getting a Scat Pack. It truly is an amazing vehicle. And if I didn't have the opportunity that I did 2 years ago to get this one for the deal that I did, I would have no problems continuing to own the Scat Pack because that thing is probably the perfect amount of power for both city and highway driving. But if I do ever come across the Scat Pack and I have some extra change to spare, maybe I would pick it up again and kind of reminisce on the nostalgia of owning a really cool muscle car. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you can still see me on the screen because it's getting pitch black, dark outside. If this is your first time stopping by, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for all of the weekly videos. Also, check me out on all the social media at Schwazy_. And as always, everybody, I hope you stay Schwazy, stay healthy, have a wonderful day.